Welcome to lesson 2. In this lesson, we are going to develop an authentication plugin. And in doing so, we're going to look at the Moodle development guidelines, plugin required files, the required files for plugin development, and we'll also look at the string API, the Moodlelib API, which is like the Swiss knife of the Moodle APIs. We'll look at class autoloading and namespaces. We'll also touch on the privacy API, and then we'll look at some development tools and development guidelines. So let's start our lesson by looking at the Moodle development guidelines. Now, there's no obligation on third-party plugin developments to use the development guidelines, but it's definitely good practice to do so, particularly if your intention is to release your plugin to the plugins directory. So there's 2 links here in this page to the useful documentation on the Moodle website, and we will look at this a little later on in this lesson. There are 2 tools. One that I've spoken about these tools in lesson 1, the code checker and PHP doc checker, that help you follow the guidelines with your code. And one way is to to install and add the folders to the gitignore file, so you just keep it in your development environment. It really depends on how you manage your Git repository. Okay. So before we dive into the required files for plugin development, I need to talk about Frankenstein. Not Frankenstein the monster, but Frankenstein, which is the name given to the naming convention that is used throughout Moodle. And when I say it's used throughout Moodle, it is basically just about everywhere in Moodle. And the naming conventions are important if you want your plugin to fit in properly with the Moodle framework. So the format of it is kind of simple. So for example, a repository plugin called Google Drive will have the Frankenstein name of repository _ Google Drive, and will be installed in the repository Google Drive folder. And there's a link there to look at Frankenstein in more detail, but we will be using this throughout the course, and you'll soon get quite used to it. So it's basically type of plugin plus the name of your plugin separated by an underscore. So let's look at the required files for plugin development. These are the files that you basically have to define every single time you start a plugin development. The first one of those is version PHP. Now, I'm mentioning here a couple of things relating to the development guidelines, and that is that each code file should have the masthead fully stipulated at the top of the file. So this is the masthead. That's the masthead that's recommended to be used for every single file. On top of that, each code file should have a PHP doc block underneath the masthead that describes the file and what it does, as well as defining some tags that are required, and the PHP doc tool will pick up if you don't specify these. And the ones that are usually required are package, copyright, license. Categories only basically used for core APIs, but there are other tags, and we'll look at those again a little later on. So onto version PHP itself, right? You look at that defined Moodle internal or die statement at the top. It's recommended that any file that is not loaded by the browser, can't be called by the browser, should have that at the top after the header stuff. That's simply to ensure that nobody can call the file directly from the browser. Then there are some required properties of plugin having been defined earlier, that are required. So one is your plugin's version, your property called requires, which stipulates what version of Moodle your plugin is for. It's usually that and above. And then you've got your plugin component name, which is your Frankenstein name for your plugin. Okay, component plugin sometimes interchangeably used. Your component, I think you're more likely to use component when you're including core functionality, core libraries as well, and then plugins when you're talking specifically about plugins. Then you've got another property, dependencies. It's optional, you don't need to specify it, but that allows you to specify any dependencies that your plugin might have on other plugins or core functionality. Okay, there are other variables, and if you go to the page in the link here, the documentation page at that link, you'll get more information. It's become quite elaborate. It's turned into a more elaborate system in defining version PHP. But that's your normal minimum that you'd be required to have in your version PHP. The next one we're going to look at is the language file. Now, Moodle has support for over 80 languages, and the support is provided by putting the strings information, so any string outputs, into language packs. And English, the Australian version, because Moodle was originally developed in Australia, is the default language for code, comments, and documentation. Language files live in the language subdirectory and another subdirectory for the language. So you'll have lang /en/ for the English default language strings. Now, language strings, if you use the English language strings, there's support if you do end up releasing your plugin to the plugins directory. There's some support in translating those language strings, and we'll talk about that at some point later in this course. The file name is basically your plugin's Frankenstein name .php. So for the authentication plugin that we are going to develop, our language file will live in the auth text file lang en auth _ text file php. Okay, and strings are defined as items of a strings associative array, and the minimum required definition for nearly absolutely all plugins is the string plugin name, which then gives is the name that's used when the plugin is being installed or uninstalled, etc. Okay. So we'll talk a little bit more about the language strings. So in your code, to retrieve a language string, you call getString, the getString function with your string name and your plugin name. So your plugin's Frankenstein name in the code. So if the code, let's say the site is in Swahili, then what will happen is the code will look in the Swahili language file to get hold of the string. The function printString will just echo the string directly. So get string into a variable, printString, echo it directly. Right. Runtime parameters can be passed for substitution in the string, and they are passed as a third parameter to the getString or printString calls, and it can be a scalar, an array, even an object, and it is normally referred to as the A variable, $A variable. And so then you can then define the variable in your string. So for example, there I've got an example on the screen there. My full name is a full name, and what you have to remember is it's always enclosed in curly brackets for it to work. However, if you are defining a string with that parameter for substitution, the string must be defined in single quotes. Probably best to have single quotes for all your strings unless it's absolutely necessary, or it's easier to use double quotes. Right. The other file, now this is an optional file, but I quite suspect in many cases, if you're doing plugin development, is the db install XML. And this file defines the plugin's database files. It's required for modules, for activity modules, but it's optional for all other plugins. And this XML DB tool, I've spoken about that before as well, will help you design tables, etc., except when it comes to modules, because you need to have the modules, the install XML file defined to install the module, whereas in most cases, and I'll say this several times in the course, in most cases what you want to do is get the minimum files enough to get your plugin installed, and then use the XMLDB tool to actually do your tables, create your tables and design your tables before you carry on with your development. Right, exceptions for the libphp file. So that's another file that you'll find many plugins will require the libphp file to be defined. Now, sometimes the libphp file only has functions in it, but sometimes it's a requirement that it implements a class. So libphp files, the notable exceptions to not having to define them, because they define their own separate additional required files, is the authentication, the blocks, and local plugins. So each plugin type will have a minimum of functions that must be implemented. This is how the APIs or the plugin system works together. And sometimes, as I said a little earlier, the API requires it to be a class definition. For example, course formats, which we'll look at in a future lesson. Since Moodle loads all the plugins libphp files, it is recommended that the file is kept to a minimum. So those, in a nutshell, are the required files for all plugins. We will go through all the ones that we develop in this course, and we'll see the exceptions. We will be looking at all the exceptions, the authentication, which we're doing in this lesson, blocks, and local plugins. Since we touched on the strings in our required files presentation, now would be a good time to just have a deeper look at the string API. So the string language files are part of the string kind of API. And this handles, like I mentioned, in international languages, etc., and provides as well some general string functions. So the functions I spoke about earlier, the getString and its printString, are two of a few wrappers which actually reside within the Moodlelib API for methods provided by the string manager class. So the string manager class has some useful methods. So you can check if a string exists. So you can check if a file or a string exists somewhere. You can also do things like get a list of the countries, a localized list of all countries, get a list of languages, a list of currencies, and you can check if a translation actually exists. The core text class, which kind of falls inside the string API, is a useful class to know as well. So this class is actually specifically developed to handle and deal with UTF-8 text. So it has several static methods familiar to anyone who's a PHP developer that kind of reflect the core Moodle functionality. So you've got things like a sort, string length, string position, to lower, to upper, etc., and substring. So for more information, you can look at the class itself, or you can look at the link, follow the link in this presentation on this page. And since we mentioned the Moodlelib API, we might as well have a look at it as well. So the Moodlelib API, I describe it as a sort of Swiss knife of the Moodle APIs. Anything that doesn't quite fit anywhere else kind of ends up in Moodlelib. But it also provides many general purpose functions. For example, as related to strings, we've got the get string, print strings that we talked about. And to use the string manager methods, you would then get string manager to get an instance of the class, and then you would be able to do call the functions that I spoke about earlier. Okay, it defines several classes, including language string, a special class to handle the generation of strings. And the API is all housed in the Moodlelib PHP file in the lib folder. Right. So apart from the string stuff, and more useful to us as we're going to develop an authentication plugin in this lesson, things that are to do with authentication and user specific functions. So you have things like get enabled auth plugins to find out which authentication plugins are enabled, or just to get an authentication plugin. You've got get auth plugin. You've got require login, require logout, require an admin user. So check kind of the user's status. Then we've got things like full name, which returns the user's name in the correct format for the language, etc. And if you wanted to do something else with usernames, you can get all the username fields, as well as create a user record, a bare bones create a user record, or you can delete user. You can also set the user's preferences, and you can return dates in the format that is based on the user's language or settings, etc. And there's also functionality to deal with passwords, so resetting passwords, checking passwords, and a couple of password constants such as password lower, password upper, and password digits to check passwords, especially for the policy set by the admin for the Moodle site. Right, so other things, input parameters, so stuff that is being posted to your script. You can clean the parameters, check for parameters, set defaults by using the optional parameter method or call. And you have several constants defined, such as text, boolean, etc. So you can check your the input as you require. And then you have things like value related constants, such as value required or value optional, all kind of related. Then you've got configured variables like set config and get config to get global configuration settings. Then you've got caching. Purge caches is a useful one to have because you do a lot of that when you're a developer of plugins in Moodle. And then we've got course related kind of functionality like delete course, remove course contents, and other stuff like that. And the course is strong in Moodlelib because in a way that was the first thing that was kind of core functionality for Moodle. So you have activity type feature constants, so that you can define the features of your plugins, especially relating to modules, and modules being activities or resources in the course. And you have other constants to define your module. We'll touch on these again on all of this in this course. Right, and then there are other, that's why I called it the Swiss army knife, because it's basically got lots of different things within the API. So you've got things for date and time, so format time, day of the week, get time interval strings, and then some constants defined like an hour 6, day 6, day months. You'll come across that again in the form API, where sometimes you'll be using those. File related functionality such as get file storage, clean file name, get file packer. We'll touch on these again in this course when we look at files and uploading and managing files. Email functionality to send emails to users or get the mailer and generate such things as sign-offs. Then you can also get some lists. So you can get the list of character sets and plugins and themes, etc. And you can work with emoticons by getting the emoticon manager and then calling the methods in that particular class. And then other things like fix UTF-8 to ensure that a value is valid UTF-8, is number to check if it's a number, and format float to format numbers for display. So that's Moodlelib, kind of the Swiss Army knife of the Moodle API functionality, and we will definitely be seeing quite a few of these functions as we progress through the course. So let's start with our authentication plugin, and our authentication plugin is going to live in the auth directory, and it will allow authenticate users against a text file. So we're going to call it text file. And so our sub plugin, our plugins folder will be text file. Now my IDE allows me to actually define several directories at the same time, so I'm going to add in the language directory at the same time. So let's start. Our first file is always version PHP, so we'll start with a PHP file called version.php, and we're gonna finish. So this is our version PHP with our masthead and our start file doc block, and that's our Frankenstein name, our component name, which we define down here, and we've defined the required properties for the plugin object, which is our version, the version that's required of Moodle. In this case, we are requiring that Moodle 3.11 will be used, and our component name, which is auth_text file. So our next file is to create the language file. So we'll create a language file. Auth_text file PHP is our language file. So this is our language file. So English language file with the normal stuff at the top, and then the required plugin name item in the string associative array for the name of our plugin. So authentication plugins, if you remember, were one of the exceptions to the rule about the libphp file. In fact, authentication plugins don't require a libphp file, but they do require an auth.php file to be defined. And we will now go ahead and define that. So we'll go back here, create a new PHP file called auth.php. So auth.php, this is what it looks like, the usual stuff at the top, and you need to require the auth-lib library. So that's the API, if you want, being loaded there, and the class we're extending. So this is a case that this file needs to be a class definition. We're extending auth plugin base, which comes from our auth-lib.php up there, and our plugin name has to be auth_plugin_. text file, which is the name of our plugin. And then required methods, two required methods, the constructor, which then has to set a property called auth type. So our auth type is text file. And then there's another required method, which is the user login, obviously, which gets passed the username and password when called, and it returns true to allow a user to log in. Simple enough, isn't it? Authentication plugins are actually one of the easiest plugins to piggyback on. So for example, we wouldn't need to extend auth plugin base. We could have easily extended something like auth plugin manual, which would then mean that most of the functionality that is required for an authentication plugin is taken care of, and then you just override those functions that you want to use. So the manual authentication plugin is actually a very good place to have a look into and to determine what are the kind of functions that are required or actually useful for an authentication plugin. You'll notice up here I've used the config variable. This is one of the globals that are available once the Moodle site is up and running. So it's actually loaded by settings PHP very early in the process of loading the plugins, etc. Okay, so at this point we can actually install our plugin, and if we had a database, we'd be going to or if we had database tables, we'd be going to use the tool to define our tables. We don't have any tables to worry about, but we will have something else we need to look at. But let's go and install our plugin for now. So I'm going to log in as an administrator. We haven't got any other users in the system yet anyway. So do an upgrade, install our plugin, and authentication plugins need to be enabled. So once we've got it down, we go to plugins, look at authentication plugins, manage authentication plugins, and then we can look down and find our text file authentication and click there to enable it. For at the moment, not much, this won't do very much. So further down you've got the common settings for authentication plugins, useful to have a look at. I've touched on it when we did the tour of Moodle in lesson 1. But anyway, so I'm going to log out and let's talk about where the users are going to come from for our authentication plugin. Our users are going to come out of a tab separated text file called userdbt with the extension TSV for tab separated values. And in the file, all we'll have is the email address. We're using the email address as the username for a very specific reason, which we'll find out about in a little while, and an MD5 hashed password, all set to the same, so I don't have to try and remember the hundreds of different passwords for this exercise. But this file needs to reside in your Moodle data directory, and it must be readable by the web server user. But it's very simple, and this is the file we're going to use to determine whether the person is a user of Moodle. Okay, so back in our code, we need to do some more. One of the things we need to do is tell Moodle that the user data doesn't exist inside Moodle, it is outside of the Moodle database. So we have a function that we need to define and called is_internal, and we'll add that now. So this is our function, and we're returning false to Moodle so that it knows that the data is not internal to the Moodle system. Okay, so now let's extend our user login function or method. So this is our new user login method. We've got the username and the password coming through. We are using the global config and using that to find out where our user db.tsv lives, and we check if it exists, and then we read in the file lines, and then we for each line in the file, we are splitting the line into the user and the password, remember. So we do that, and then we check to see if the user equals the username, and if it is, double check the password, return true if it's the same, or return false if it's not. So that's as simple as it is. That's the user login. Now with just that, we could actually log in as one of the users in our text file, but we're not going to. Since all Moodle will have at this point is a username and password on login, the user will then be prompted to fill in additional information about themselves for their profile. Okay, and the other function, this extra data includes the email address. Now we've used the email address as the username, but Moodle doesn't know that. So what we have to do now is provide the email address to Moodle, so it does not ask for the email address. Now there's a reason for that. The reason is that if we left that blank, when the user enters in the email address, you go through the whole process of having to verify the email address. It's seen as a change of email of email address by the Moodle system, and therefore it goes through the whole process of verifying the new email address. So we want to avoid doing that. So what we're going to do, we're going to define a function to avoid that situation. So the function we need is get user info and the username. So what we do then is we get passed in the username, and what we do is return back an array with the email, with an email item, email key, and the username as the email value. So this will avoid the user having to have to go through the new email verify email process. There are some other methods that need overriding. So let's define those before we actually get into actually trying to authenticate as one of those users. So these new functions is configured, to let Moodle know if the plugin has been configured, to ensure that if you have some configuration settings that need to be set, you can check them there and return true if all is in order. Then you can also determine whether the user can change their password. So if the user can change their password, you can return true. If not, you return false. And related to that is change password URL. So if a user can change their password, you need to give Moodle the URL for the password change functionality. Now that is mainly because we're not internal, and therefore Moodle won't be using its internal change password for the user. Okay, so these are the functions that really you need to have in your auth.php file. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to attempt to log in as one of the users in the file and see how that goes. So we're going to log in as one of the users. I've chosen Jack to be my guinea pig. I hope I've got the password right. Let's see if we can log in. Okay, we'll save Jack. So as you notice, straight away I've been sent to this screen. I've logged in and I'm being asked for all the other stuff that Moodle needs to work. So I can do Jack Moodle. See, the email address is filled in already. That's because we sent that information back, and then the user can do update their profile as they see fit. Okay, So that's the core functionality of our authentication plugin done. But I would like to have a look at the privacy API and see how we could maybe integrate that as an example of what you would do with any of the different plugins that you might find yourself developing. So let's have a look at the privacy API. So the privacy API and things surrounding privacy. The General Data Protection Regulation, generally shortened to GDPR, is a regulation in EU law on data protection and privacy within the European Union and the European Economic Area. And it came into effect around the 25th of May in 2018. And it basically gave citizens the right to request information about the data being held about them, access all of that data, actually request and have all the data deleted and completely forgotten. And many other countries will also have some kind of privacy data protection legal obligations. Us in the UK are no longer members of the EU or the EEA, so we will have our own kind of data protection and privacy. We have a data protection framework in the UK, so I suspect other countries will also have similar kind of things. Okay. So the Privacy API was made available in Moodle 3.5 following that, following the GDPR regulations, and has been improved several times in later versions. So basically, the API allows developers to describe the personal data it is storing and provides the means for that data to be discovered, exported, and deleted. So it's a requirement now. If you look at all the core plugins and core components, you will find the privacy files implemented that we'll talk about in a little bit. So plugins should implement one metadata provider and optionally one or more request providers. So metadata provider describes the data and its purpose, and the request provider acts upon user requests, such as the right to be forgotten or a subject access request, a request about what data is being held. Many Moodle plugins don't tend to store personal data. That tends to be a core function. But there may be, cases where you do actually store outside of the Moodle main tables, user tables. So, for example, enrollment plugins will normally use the Moodle enrollment tables for the enrollment. So, not really providing or storing the user data somewhere else. So if you don't store personal data, then you have to define a null metadata provider, and null providers are implemented extending null provider extension class at that in that namespace, which is the opposite of defining an extension to the provider class. So, and then you have a manager class that provides the glue between these two different components of the privacy functionality. So for more information about the GDPR and privacy, there's some links there for you to have a look at. Now, I'm going to take this opportunity to actually integrate the privacy API into our authentication plugin. So before we integrate privacy into our plugin, we need to understand a little bit about class autoloading and namespaces. So from version 2.6, Moodle has supported autoloading and namespaces, and there's a link there for you to go and have a look at it. But you have to follow some certain rules, and they're not quite the same as the PHP rules for namespaces. But when you look at the documentation, you'll see what I mean. Okay. So the class files that you want auto-loaded must exist in the plugins classes subdirectory and its subfolders, and it needs to follow certain rules to be auto-loaded. So some of the rules: each class should reside in its own file, and the namespace should follow the Frankenstyle convention, and the file name and the class name need to be the same. Now that's a slight change from how it used to be before. Before, the class name had to follow the Frankenstyle convention. Not quite sure what the namespace one was, but I think Frankenstyle for the namespace, Frankenstyle for the class name. But now the file name and the class name simply need to be the same. Okay, so for example, the check input class in, let's say, web service underscore bulk enroll web service plugin would be in the file web service, which is where web services live, bulk enroll, that's the plugin, and then its classes folder where you would find check input.php. Obviously, the namespaces are designed to improve code organization, and the rule is that your namespaces should follow the directory structure in your class's subdirectory. So namespaces are not required for any new code, and there's no requirement to move to non-space classes, non-namespace classes to namespaces. There's no requirement for that. However, there are cases where the use of auto-loading classes is mandated. So for example, raising events, and in our case, for the privacy stuff, you have to your files have to be in auto-loaded namespaces. Okay, and other areas such as developing web services. So classes are normally cached, and therefore when developing code you might have to refresh your cache. However, if you've got debugging set, which you should have when you're developing, you don't need to. They're not cached. So now that we've got a little bit of understanding, we'll now go and kill two birds with one stone, look at privacy, integrating privacy into our plugin, and at the same time look and understand the namespacing and auto-loading issues. Okay, so back in our code, let's integrate a null provider for our plugin. So we'll go ahead, build a folder, classes, okay, privacy. That's our folder, okay. And in there we will define a new file, PHP, what's this, and the file name needs to be provider dot, would help to spell it right, provider. So this is our file, usual stuff at the top. Okay, namespace comes before your defined line. It's always got to be the first thing declared in the file if you are using namespaces. So nothing before it. Straight after the doc block, you declare your namespace. Okay, and our class is called provider because our file is called provider PHP, and what we're doing is we're implementing, so not extending, implementing the core null provider for the privacy. And then the only thing we need to define in this file is the function called getReason, and we return what looks like some kind of code, but it isn't. It's actually a language string. So what we need to do then is also define a language string for our privacy metadata. To be more accurate, you're actually returning the name of the string that rather than the actual string itself. So let's switch back to our language file and do something there. So our language file, we've added the string for the privacy metadata, and it basically says the text file authentication plugin does not store any personal data. And that, in a nutshell, is integrating the privacy API in your plugins. very simple, and in lots of cases that's all you need to do, because like I said, a lot of plugins don't actually store user data. But if you did, you would need to look into the documentation to find out how you actually do specify a provider. Okay, right, so that's it for our authentication plugin. But we still got some time in this lesson, so we're going to swing back and go back to our Moodle development guidelines and look at the tools. First of all, look at the two tools I spoke about, and then again look at the development guidelines. So you might remember this, the second page of our presentation from the beginning of the lesson. So those are the two tools we're going to have a look at: the code checker and the PHP doc checker, and we're going to use them against the plugin that we've just developed. So let's go and have a look at them in Moodle. So I'm going to log in as an administrator, and we're going to go to the development section of site admin, and down here we have code checker, which we installed in lesson 1. So PHP doc checker I did not install, so I intend to install it now so we can work with it currently. So if you remember, just a quick refresher, you go plugins and install plugins, and I've got a zip file, so I'm going to add the zip file to this. There we go, and I'm going to install the plugin. And we have to go through quite a few screens to get there, but we get there. Okay. It's called Moodle check rather than PHP doc check, but everybody seems to refer to it as the PHP doc checker. So if we go back to development, we now have both of them in place for us. So let's start with the doc check. Okay, so our path to our plugin is auth text file, and you do have some options here when using this tool, right? So you can check over all the rules, which is the default, but then you can select actual different things that or uncheck anything that you don't want checked against your code or your plugin. So I normally leave all the rules on because I want to check that I cover all the options. So I normally just don't bother with that. So here we go. Let's have a check. So we've got some errors, and what we got, version seems to be okay, but the auth PHP file, our main file, has quite a few errors in it, and it's simply that none of the functions have been documented. So we need to go back and document those. The language file seems okay, but even our privacy file that we've just completed has issues in terms of documentation. So let's try and fix those. Let's go back to our code and fix those. I'll leave us logged in. So back in our code, let's first deal with provider PHP. So I've added in the documentation. So this we had already, as we were trying to do, as we've been doing all along. But here we go, we've got a doc block for the class, okay, and we also then have added PHP docs for the actual function. So that's our provider, and let's have a look at our auth PHP. So we go to auth. So here we go. Added in the class documentation, and we've added in. I've left that one deliberately blank to see what happens, and then we've got obviously function documentation for each of the other functions. So let's go, and I'll save that, and we'll go and see what happens when we refresh the the check. So back in Moodle, let's hit check, and you see it's still picked out that user login is not documented. So I'll fix that, and then we can move on to the next thing. So let's now look at the code checker. So again, same thing, auth text file. You can exclude particular paths and files, etc. here if you needed to. You know, you might have some files that for example, if you're using third-party libs libraries, you might not be in control of the code that's in those files, and you won't want to be updating files like that. So you could have them excluded. So I'm going to run check code, and we do have some issues that have been found. So what have we got? We've got change password URL, no space before the brace, and we have the requires in our version PHP, our inline documentary has not got a full stop or some kind of punctuation at the end of it. So you've got inline comments, etc., and then you need to check some aspects against the coding guidelines. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go fix those, and then we'll refresh this, and then we'll go and have a look at the Moodle coding guidelines as to what's actually being checked when you run this tool. So back in Moodle, we know in version we need to put a full stop after that, and we can save that, and then let's go back and sort out the issues in our auth PHP file. So I've kind of killed two birds with one stone here. I've added in the documentary for the commentary, the doc block for our user login function that will clear us on the PHP doc check, and down where change password URL, I've added the space in. So let's look at what this looks like now. So back into Moodle, let's do a check again and see. We've got it. It's lovely. Right. So that's what these tools do. So let's have a quick look at the documentation on the Moodle website. Coding styles. So we'll just browse through this for a few minutes, touch on some interesting bits, and then we'll close off our lesson. So down here we've got the overview. So it describes style guidelines for people working with Moodle code. You got to remember sometimes this documentation is more aimed at core developers than it is at plugin developers, but we're trying to be we're trying to follow the development guidelines as much as we possibly can. Okay, right. So the goals is a consistent coding style, obviously, and the abstract goals is simplicity. That's one thing that is really clear when you look at Moodle code. They really like the idea of things being simple rather than clever. Readability, so it's easy to look at, and things like that. Okay, so here we have the recommendation to use those two tools that we've just looked at. Okay, so then we look at the different areas. So we've got file formatting, as in PHP tags always full, right? Indentation, for spaces instead of tabs, and you don't indent your first level. So don't indent the main script level. So that's one of the things. Maximum line length, 132 characters, but if really push to come to shove, 180 characters. The exception is your language files, because you may have some long strings to define. Okay, so wrapping lines, sets kind of things, definitions of how you wrap lines. Look at that, an extra indentation there for something that's carrying on. Wrapping if statements, wrapping class declarations, wrapping function signatures, wrapping parameters for function calls, wrapping arrays, And then line termination. So line termination, Unix line feed, nothing else. Must not use alone. No white space characters at the end of the line. A lot of IDEs, if you set them up, will take the trailing blanks off. No extra blank lines at the end of the file. So every file should just end with a single line feed character. Now I don't know if I follow that very well. I normally have an extra line in my code, but that's the kind of idea they want. So file names, again, remember a lot of this is covered by your Frankenstyle names anyway, but lower cases, short as possible, be whole English names to make it easy for somebody to find those files or know what a file is. And then again, class names, functions and method names, function parameters, variables, the constants, how you define constants, Frankenstyle prefix with the plugin name, see, that kind of stuff. Booleans and the null value always in lowercase. Namespaces, stuff about namespaces. And we go down there, they give you lots of examples, so you really get a good sense of what is good and what is bad. So never use the namespace magic constant. Namespace bracketed blocks, don't like that. Okay, so you can see, we'll keep going down in case there's something really catches my eyes. So rules for level 1, rules for level 2, etc. Namespaces. Then you come to strings, how you define your strings. Use single quotes when the string is literal or contains lots of double quotes. So especially in your strings file, and I always go for trying to keep it single quotes. So double quotes, less useful, but as you know, that's when you want to include a variable in your string. So, and then they have SQL queries in double quotes, because you normally will have single quotes around your fields, etc. And there's certain guidelines about how you actually do SQL in your code. There is there's guidelines as to how to actually format SQL statements in your code. You could have a look at that by yourself. So variable substitution, it can be both those forms. Concatenation with the full stop operator, and normally I think now they expect spaces between there. I don't know if this documentation is out of date a little bit, but if I remember rightly, the code checker will pick up if there's no space between the concatenation dot operator. So there you go. Then things like capitals in language strings, so always look like this. So they don't, that capital, what they call capitalized case, is not what is regarded as good practice. So there you go. Okay, or white spaces stuff, arrays, class declarations. Now we're getting into the PHP doc stuff. So the class declarations, functions and methods, control statements, how they defined, switches, for each, ternary operators, and the required include stuff, and more about PHP doc stuff, and the tags. So your types, etc. Short names. So we use short type names rather than full full names in tags. So then the tags, we've got copyright, license, param, return, var, and then other stuff that's more elaborate. Users, access, package required, category not always required, since more for the core developers, C, @link, at deprecated used quite a bit in the core when deprecating plugin code. Throws, if you throwing exceptions, and other specific tags that are for testing, such as this at given, at when, etc. And then the files. What your file documentation that I've spoken about previously. And so this is so this, it's a long page, but it's worth reading through. A lot of it might make sense, so you probably do it automatically anyway, but there are things that you can probably learn from this. But if you use, like I've said before, if you use the code checker tool, you'll get picked up for certain things, and you'll start to think about them automatically. But there's some dangerous functions: eval, preg replace, backticks, and go to, etc. And then there's a bit about git commits, and I think that's more aimed at the code developers. So some credits there, and then some other coding styles. So you look at the JavaScript coding styles, CSS coding styles, the SQL one that I mentioned earlier, etc. So that's that page, and the link is in the lesson, so you don't need to go hunting for the link, and it's in the presentation as well. So let's now close off our lesson and review what we've learned in this lesson. So that is it for lesson 2. So let's review what we've done. We developed an authentication plugin. We've looked at the Moodle development guidelines, both at the beginning and at the end of our lesson. We looked at the required files for plugin development. We touched on, we looked at the string API, the Moodlelib API. We also talked about class autoloading and namespaces, especially as regards the privacy API, which we integrated into our plugin. And then we finalized the lesson by looking at the 2 development tools, and then having an overview of the development guidelines at the end of the lesson.